This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Henri Barkey, International Relations Professor at Lehigh University and Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Hello, Henri, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We are speaking on Tuesday, March 3rd. This marks 17 years in power for Erdogan, the longest of any leader in Turkey's history. He has made significant achievements, including greater prosperity, improved transportation and infrastructure, and a sizable military buildup. But most observers see all this being undermined by problematic economic policies and a dismantling of the rule of law. 2 weeks ago came what many see as the cherry on top: the rearrest of Osman Kavala after he and 8 others have been acquitted in charges linked to the Gezi protests. Aside from your personal connection, which we will get to in a minute, I wonder what Kavala's acquittal and rearrest meant to you in terms of the state of Turkish democracy.
Look, the state of Turkish democracy, basically, it's on life support. There isn't much democracy left, in the sense that, unfortunately, nowadays, you can be arrested for what I would call any lèse-majesté type of crime, i.e. criticizing the president or criticizing the conduct of the Turkish government. You don't have a free press anymore. Academia has been silenced. A lot of academics have been fired. The same thing is true for civil society organizations. So, unfortunately, there is no democracy in Turkey, and it's too bad. I mean, it's because Turkey was never a perfect democracy. Yes, the military used to be very, very much in control, but there was still a very vibrant press. There was a vibrant discussions outside, if you want, official circles. But that has disappeared. People are afraid. People are afraid to talk. People are afraid to criticize. And when they do, it's a small and limited number of people who somehow maybe are allowed to, and most of that criticism takes place online or outside of Turkey, and most Turkish citizens do not see that.
Well, I guess I was pointing towards many saw the acquittal as a sign of hope, but then those hopes were quickly dashed. But you didn't kind of fall for any of that.
No, I mean, sure, I was happy to see him acquitted. I was a little bit surprised, but I also knew that they were going to come up with another indictment because they had been hinting at this for a while. And it is possible that, within the ruling circle, so to say, or they may have contemplated releasing Osman for a little while, but that didn't last very long, obviously.
Right. Kavala was rearrested on charges linked to the 2016 failed coup, specifically partially in regards to an alleged meeting with you a few days later at, I believe, Karaköy Lokantası, which actually is an old favorite of mine as well. The Turkish government has, since the attempted coup, accused you of being involved, presumably because you have worked for the State Department and you were in Turkey overseeing a conference on the island of Büyükada during the attempted coup. So I wonder, how does it feel to again have your name mentioned among the coup plotters nearly 4 years later and be linked to this Kavala case? You're a Turkey expert, a Turkey analyst. Your job is to comment on the news. It must be a bit surreal, not to mention problematic, to instead be the news.
Absolutely. And if you look at the new indictment, or this preliminary indictment of a page, which is about a page and a half long, if I believe, there is nothing in that indictment except for his connection to me, which of course they invent. I mean,
and they misspell your name, I believe.
They also it is cut and paste allegations that they pick up from the newspaper, from even really weird sources like Idlib, which is, shall we say, an extreme left and extreme right. I mean, a nationalist left-wing newspaper that is known to manufacture things. And so they take stuff from papers like that and they put it in indictment. And it actually looks terrible for the Turkish state. I mean, the Turkish state, whatever you say about it, has a long tradition. It was a very serious institution. For prosecutors to actually lift things from newspapers and put it into an indictment it makes a mockery of the whole process. I mean, who would take any government or any state seriously that does this? And in fact, if you look at the indictment, I mean, they say that he was on the island with me, which he was not. And then the other, they make up the fact that I spoke to him for over 90 hours, which of course I did not. I did not talk to him at all. And it's just that my phone and his phone were in the same vicinity, which is central Istanbul, which is a fairly large area. And there was a chance encounter in a restaurant that a lot of people go to. And happens to be my favorite restaurant in Istanbul. Excuse me. Excuse me, I need to clear. So I happened to go that night to a restaurant to have dinner with a friend. He was having dinner with two people from Europe. In fact, what was interesting was that there he was doing, shall we say, as they say in America, God's work. That is to say, doing good things for Turkey. He was trying to convince Europe, these officials to include certain sites, historical sites in Turkey, in the UNESCO designation of, if you want that, I'll say that again. He was trying to convince these people that some historical sites of Turkey should be included in the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And by doing that, those places will be first elevated in terms of importance. There will be presumably some kind of protection, but also would enhance tourism. So here's a guy who's trying to do something for his country, and he happens to bump into me. He gets up and talks to me for 3 or 4 minutes, and that is cause for suspicion. And of course, when you look at the pro-Erdogan press, they say, "Oh, nothing can be a happenstance. Nothing can be accidental. Must have been planned." And then they also cite the fact that we were in Diyarbakir, but not at the same time, a few days apart. So he goes to Diyarbakir all the time, and I had gone another trip to Diyarbakir. So the fact that he was there 3 days before me is also a crime, it turns out. I mean, this is absurd. There's nothing one can say that is rationally attack, or rationally, I should say, defend yourself from such accusations. I mean, they keep inventing enormous number of facts. And what they don't even realize is how the Turkish press itself that invents these things. There was one article which had a long article about my exploits. So at the beginning of the article, they said that the night of the coup, I was on the island, obviously conducting the coup. But by the time you get to the end of the article, it says that I landed in Istanbul an hour and a half after the coup started, and I didn't go to the island. I went to some place, some obscure place in Istanbul. So how can I be in two different places at the same time? It doesn't matter. I mean, reality.
You must be a mastermind, Henri.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, you start, you want to give up on. But on the other hand, this is Osman has been in jail now for over 2 years, and it's really, really unfair. Imagine I would say this for all the listeners. I mean, put yourself in his shoes. You haven't done anything, and you're spending all this time in jail. And look, he's 63 years old, so he's been in jail since he's been 61. We don't have that many years left at that age, right, in this world.
But also the good work he's been doing is suffering. He's unable to do it anymore. That
right.
helps Turkey.
Right. That obviously they don't. I mean, clearly they don't care. And so I mean, it must be so frustrating. I mean, you probably would want to hit your head against the prison walls. I mean, what do you do? What do you do? And you can't rationally say, look, this is not true.
Right. Obviously, you're not in prison, but you're still unable to travel to Turkey, where I believe you were born and spent part of your childhood.
Right.
How has all this affected your life and your
Well,
work? Have you considered shifting your focus away from Turkey to something else?
uh, well, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, there is an arrest warrant on me, and so clearly, and I've been warned by the U.S. government not to go. And of course, I wasn't going to risk it in any case. Certainly, it makes it much more difficult for me to do work on Turkey because people are intimidated to talk to me. I can't travel, and I've always believed that the kind of work I do requires me to travel, talk to people, do research. So at that level, in terms of my own career, it's been a major blow. But look, I'm an academic. I've been around for a while, and I have enough of a, shall we say, intellectual and let me start that. I've been around as an academic for a while. I have enough of intellectual background and experience, so I can go on for a while. But also, I am actually starting another project, which is much bigger than Turkey. So it will probably involve Turkey as well, but I will be looking at Turkey and some other countries. So that's, I can survive. I mean, it's people like Osman and it's not just Osman, it's thousands and thousands of people who have been charged with no evidence. I mean, in a sense, the Osman case is important because Osman, having all these connections outside of Turkey, then allows people outside to understand and realize what really is happening in Turkey. And otherwise, a lot of these people who have been jailed, who have never been abroad, would not have any. People would not be conscious of their fate. Now, Osman's case actually allows the outside world to realize that the Turkish judicial system is not really a judicial system. It's just so in that sense. But the final thing I should say about, in terms of, and I don't want to make this about me, but of course for me it's very sad. Look, I grew up in Istanbul. I'm amazingly fond of the country, and even though I may not like the politics, but there are many countries I don't like the politics, but I like the country, and I have a history. I mean, my family is buried there, and in my tradition, you go and visit the tombs every year. You have them washed. I mean, these are small things that you can't. And at an hotel that has always been a kind of icon of this, a 19th century hotel, I actually have a stylized drawing of that hotel in my living room in Washington. So so I wanted to do it in a place that also was meaningful to me. And just because they wanted to blame the United States for the coup, and I happened to be a good excuse, and they invented this whole concoction. And there you have it. And they use it for a whole bunch of things. I mean, it's not just Osman. I mean,
I don't know if you should blame the holding that conference on Buyukada. I mean, there's a possibility they may have blamed you even if you hadn't had any conference. I mean, Lehigh is in Pennsylvania. Let's not forget.
yeah, but that's, I don't. It requires a little bit of imagination to suddenly, blame me because
Sure.
I in Pennsylvania. I also live in Washington, and I'm also, I've been affiliated with the State Department, obviously, but also with think tanks. So look, it was convenient. I mean, and there's no question that this was a deliberate attempt by the government. I mean, the first indication that the government was behind this was that the first stories that appeared in the press after the coup about me had my arrival and departure times through passport control and this is something only the government knows, not Turkish, especially journalists that work for rags like Sabah, Akşam. Turkey would never in a million years have journalists do research, and the government fed them the stuff, and they just dutifully got it done. Anyway, that's the story. But look, to see that they use this to keep somebody in jail, and the Washington Post, for example, 2 Sundays ago had a very, very tough editorial about Osman. I mean, if the Turks think that, people have forgotten Osman, they're wrong. I mean, people are really angry in Europe. And it is true that governments have to deal with the Turkish government. That's how you do business. And maybe that may not come up when James Jeffries is in Turkey talking about Syria. But what is happening is that the Turks are really getting very bad press in the United States, and they can spend millions and millions of dollars as they're doing now to improve their image, but it's not going to help them.
In a recent interview with DW Turkce, you were asked whether you had any connections to Fethullah Gulen or his movement, and you responded that you had held meetings with several Gulen-linked organizations and with Zaman newspaper. So I'm guessing that means you maybe know some of the 50,000 or so people who have been arrested and detained for supposed links to Gulen and the coup plot. Speaking more broadly, what is your view of how the AKP has in the past few years expanded its purges and weaponized the FETÖ label to apply to any potential foe?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't know for a fact, and although this is being stated as facts, as God's truth, if you want, in Turkey, that the officers who did the coup or attempted coup on that day were FETÖ members. Maybe they may have been. It's not as if your uniform has a little insignia that says I'm a member of the Fethullah Gulen organization. I mean, this is all pure conjecture, and because they have purged the bureaucracy, and because they accused anybody they don't like of being a member of FETÖ, that actually undermines their case. Maybe they're right. Maybe they were these officers, but I suspect that there were other officers. They purged half of the generals and the admirals that Turkey had. Of the 400, 200 were purged. I can't believe that 200 officers in Turkey, and I mean generals and admirals, so I'm talking about the highest ranks, would be Fethullah Gulen sympathizers or members of his organization. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, I've watched the Turkish army and worked on on trying to understand the Turkish army. It is impossible for me to think that so many officers were, sympathetic to Gulen. Some of them, there are many officers who were probably very angry at AKP. There are reasons, and there is a history in Turkey of trying to have coups. So that aspect is not surprising to me. Although I think the military thought, or some members of the military thought, that they had really lost their cherished place in Turkish society, because Erdogan and Gülen together actually very effectively, very smartly managed to defeat the military politically. I mean, the military stopped being a political force. In a way, all this stuff about Gülen is to some extent shows you the disdain with which the AKP looks at the Turkish population, because they think, you say all this stuff and people will believe it. Yes, maybe 40%, 50% believe it, but there's also 50% of the country that says this is nuts.
Mm-hmm. Also, in that DW Turkce interview, I mentioned you said that you met Gülen once in the 1990s. I recently read that in, I think, 2007, you were one of a couple dozen intellectuals who wrote to a U.S. judge vouching for Gülen to help him get his green card.
No. I was not.
Okay.
I had nothing to do. I never got for Gülen. I would never. I mean, this is not something I would write necessarily as a professor, and I never did. I mean, other people did. I mean, there's a story that other people did, and I think I know maybe two of them. But
so there was a letter, but you did not take part.
No, I didn't even know. The irony, of course, is that I did not even know that there was such a letter. It was done without. I mean, I can't obviously know everything that's going on. I mean, Turkey is a big country. There are lots of people who work on Turkey and who are interested in Turkey, and I'm not the person who has to clear everything. No, I did not know about this.
Sure. So 6 weeks after the coup attempt, you wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times in which you said U.S.-Turkey relations were among the casualties of the failed coup, pointing to unprecedented conspiracy theories and anti-Americanism. If anything, the demonization of the U.S. and the West by Turkey's largely pro-government media has only increased in the years since then. How do you think this negativity has impacted Turkey's relations with the U.S., the Europe, and the West?
I think I'm glad you raised that issue. I actually think that this is probably the most important aspect of the damage that has been done since the coup, because this constant barrage in Turkey against the United States immediately after the coup, and again, they use me to justify that to a large extent, does long-term damage, because yes, there has always been anti-Americanism in Turkey, and I remember that, and it used to come usually from the extreme left and the Islamist. And in between, people might be, people always think that the CIA does this, the CIA does that. But in general, you may criticize U.S. policy. I mean, and U.S. policy should be criticized. But people were not anti-American and not irrationally anti-American. But now what's happening is that when you accuse everything, whether the lira goes down in value or the coronavirus or everything is blamed on the United States, and especially this notion that the United States wants to divide Turkey, wants to break up Turkey. I mean, they don't really realize that, sure, if the United States really wanted to do that, they could have done it many years ago. If the United States wanted to do that, why bring Turkey into NATO? Why sell weapons to Turkey? And you look, even in this crisis in Syria, I mean, the default position of the United States government has always been to help the Turks. Sure, the United States government, and when I was in the government too, I could see it. I mean, there were issues of which we diverge. We diverge with the French. We diverge with the Brits. They don't accuse us of trying to split the United Kingdom into Scotland.
But I guess I'm wondering what do you think is the impact of these accusations? I talked to Mark Perini, former EU ambassador to Turkey, recently, and he said that we just ignore them. We don't really pay attention to them. We continue about our policies and our business. What do you think?
I think that's a mistake. And this is what I've been trying to also argue here. The U.S. officials and Europeans essentially look at this as background noise. In French, there's an expression that goes back to, I guess, the previous century, beginning of the previous century. Bon pour l'Orient, i.e., good for the Orient, meaning, you do something, it's not perfect, but for the Orientals, it's fine. In other words, that I think Mark's position and U.S. government's position on this issue is a little bit demeaning, because it says, the Turks are irrational, they make all this stuff, but it's not important. Mm-hmm. No, I think it's very, very important, because you are educating a whole generation of Turks in this irrational anti-Americanism. It's not just the Islamists and the extreme left, will always be, you can't change those, that's fine. But it's the middle now that has been socialized into this, especially after the coup. This notion that the coup was orchestrated by the United States. If you think the United States is trying to destroy you, is organizing a coup with you, why are you still an ally of the United States? Why are you saying the United States is our ally? Why is it that when you have a problem, you turn to the White House or to the Pentagon or the State Department for help? Just like we see in the case now with Syria. Suddenly they want Patriots, right? When they went about and bought S-400s, and when the United States said, please don't buy the S-400s, it's damaging to our F-35 program. No, because the United States was not seen as an ally. So, and now they turn around and say the United States has to give us Patriots. I'm sorry. When you have a discourse which is so anti-American, and you then turn around and try to solicit our help, not only is incongruous, but I think it has created a lot of ill will here towards Turkey, and it will have eventually an impact here.
Right. Since the failed coup, Turkey has offended the West and Western states in myriad ways, from these conspiracy theories we mentioned to many insults against top Western officials and hostage diplomacy and Eastern Mediterranean aggressions and, as you say, buying Russian S-400s. Yet, despite all this, Ankara may have the moral high ground in Idlib. I wonder what you think of this. UN officials have talked of an unfolding humanitarian horror story there, where some 3 million displaced are squeezed between advancing Syrian forces and the Turkish border. And most analysts agree that the reinforced Turkish military there has helped stave off either a massacre or another massive wave of refugees, or both, while the US, EU, and NATO have done pretty much nothing. So I wonder, do you see Turkey's approach to Idlib as reasonable or somewhat defensible? And why do you think the West has done so little there?
Okay, so I think on this particular issue, the Turks are right to get involved in it. I mean, let me put it this way. The Turks are right in terms of raising the issue of Idlib. I am not sure whether on sending tens of thousands of soldiers into Syrian territory is a smart way to approach this, because one way or the other, it may make the situation a lot worse down the road, and we can talk about that later. But the problem with the Turkish approach to Idlib is that it has not found a way to mobilize Western support, or for that matter, non-Western support. Why are we looking at the West as well? There's the Middle East, there's Asia. I mean, in other words, it hasn't. In part, it hasn't because the way Turkey approaches these kinds of issues, unfortunately, is I know the solution. You do it my way or you don't. And maybe in the beginning, certainly in the beginning, the Turks were right that the United States and the West did not really pay much attention. It's partially exhaustion, and I think the Obama administration committed a huge mistake after drawing a red line and not implementing that red line. I mean, that may have been one of the big, shall we say, disasters of the Obama administration, because essentially it showed that the West was really a paper tiger to the Syrians and allowed them to massacre people, and they did, right? But the approach that the Turks have taken, especially recently, has been one in which they decide what has to happen, and unfortunately they don't do it with an end game in sight. And I think what they did with respect to going into Syria is an example. The other big problem that the Turks have in Syria and Idlib is that who their allies are. I mean, effectively now you have the worst of the jihadists as their ally, and maybe they're right on Idlib, but look what they did in Afrin. I mean, they invaded Afrin, they kicked out the population of Afrin, and they replaced them, and they allowed for these jihadists to essentially have the day with the population of Afrin, or so you can't have it both ways. You can't. I mean, maybe it's not as bad as what the Syrians have done in Idlib, certainly not, but effectively the Turks invaded Afrin when Afrin was not a threat to them, and pushed the population. So again, you have to be, if you're going to make an argument on Idlib, you also have to be consistent. I still do agree that more should be done. That said, the other problem is that we have in Syria a government whose ally, the Russians, are intent on recapturing Idlib, right? And what is it that the United States and the West could do to prevent that, short of going to war, right? And maybe there are solutions out there, but I have not seen one which has a chance, I should say, of success. I don't know what. I mean, I think if the Turks, with the leading members of the alliance, were to spend time together, trying to come up with options, maybe something they could come up with something.
The problem
is that the Russians are heavily invested in this. They were not. I mean, the Russians haven't been in this from the beginning, mind you. So there was probably more of a chance earlier on, but now, do you want to have a confrontation with the Russians? Maybe the Russians will pull back. I don't know, but we need to think this one through. You just don't engage in activity without having worked out. And let's face it, I mean, people have, unfortunately, not done much about it. I mean, but there are situations around the world that also deserve attention, like the Uyghurs in China, who are being essentially put in concentration camps of sorts without the gas chambers, right? I mean, what's happening there is. But again, we're being quiet.
You mentioned Turkey's problematic approach. Ankara has been urging refugees within Turkey to head towards its borders with Europe, which Turkish officials said were open. In truth, Greece has been doing pretty much everything it can in recent days to keep the refugees out. What do you think of Erdogan's decision to use the refugees as a tool to pressure the EU to act on Idlib? Does it have any chance of working?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it creates more ill will, because you're weaponizing refugees. On the one hand, you're turning to the Europeans and saying you need help. And I would point out to the fact that, yes, NATO said it would not get involved militarily. In fact, it cannot legally get involved militarily in Idlib. If you read Article 6 of the alliance, there's no way NATO can do it. But behind the scenes, as Murat Yetkin, a good journalist in Turkey, has argued, everybody is trying to figure out ways to help the Turks. The Spaniards, the British, the Germans. So everybody's going out of their way behind the scenes quietly to help Turkey. And what does Turkey do is weaponize the refugees. Now, it is doing that mostly for domestic consumption, because not many refugees have left. And by the way, they're not all Syrians. A lot of them are Afghans. Mm-hmm. Right, so it's not as if they're sending Syrian refugees who are coming from Idlib, etc. No, but put that aside for a moment. If you're trying to get the Europeans to really sympathize with you, this is not the way to do it. It creates even more ill will, and once this Idlib crisis is over, the Europeans will not forget this. Mind you, as you said earlier, governments have to work with governments, and they also understand that what Erdogan is doing is really playing to the domestic audience to show. But the way he's doing it is, look, I'm punishing the Europeans, right? Again, the Europeans are put, or the West in general is put as the enemy. And I go back to this notion: if you really think that they are the enemy, then don't be an ally. Pull out. Find yourself new allies. And you can't. I mean, the Turks always. One of the things that, to me, I think the Europeans probably took very, very poorly. Erdogan at one point called Europeans Nazi remnants. I mean, first of all, most Turks know very little about Nazi Germany because it's not taught in schools. And you call Europeans Nazi remnants? I mean, after all that Europe has gone through, the millions, the tens of millions of people who died because of Nazi horror. But I think he can get away with saying this because he himself doesn't understand the horrors of Nazism. Right? I think the Turks are woefully ignorant about World War II and about what happened there. And but you don't insult Europeans by calling them Nazi remnants. Anyway, that's my take. I mean, I think if the Turks had any hope of having better relations, especially in terms of customs union and all that kind of stuff that they were looking for the Europeans, so they're not going to get it anymore. That's gone, and that has a cost. It has an opportunity cost.
Last question for you. Erdogan and Russian President Putin are meeting on Thursday to discuss a possible Idlib ceasefire. I wonder if you see that summit leading to some sort of deal. To me, the absence of EU leaders who might be able to make some commitments regarding refugees seems like a potential issue.
No, I disagree with that. I mean, I think this is between Russia and Turkey. I mean, the Turks went in, they bit more than they could chew. They actually made some mistakes. I mean, what prompted the Russians to, and let's face it, it is the Russians who killed those Turkish soldiers. It's not the Syrians, as the government claims. The Russians did it, and they did it because whether it came from, the order came from Moscow, or it came from, or local commanders decided, but they were angry at the Turks firing missiles at the Russian airplanes, and the Turks who were in Syria, and maybe even inside the jihadist allies. The point is that this was a provocation for the Russians, and the Russians decided to hit back. And it's not clear. I mean, I don't think the Russians would have wanted to kill that many Turkish soldiers, but this is war, and things really bad things happen during war. So now the Turks are faced with a crisis, and Putin has tried to help them by, you saw the other day, for instance, I think it was on Sunday, where they opened up the airspace over Syria to Turkish UAVs and Turkish aircraft that allowed the Turks to pound Syrian positions. This way, Turkey could say, look, we punished the Syrians, and they did significantly. So they can claim a little bit of, I mean, it's face-saving for Erdogan. But if this meeting still takes place, I do have sometimes doubts about whether or not it will take place. Things can happen at the last minute. But Erdogan is going to Moscow, and that is a significant symbolic gesture in that he is going to Putin's home. I mean, he is the one who's paying respect to the more forceful or the more powerful leader here. And so neither one of them want this to get out of hand. So they will work out some kind of solution. I mean, they will have to make concessions, and I think probably more concessions will come from the Turkish side than the Russians. Maybe the Russians will say, okay, you can leave again troops, maybe if not exactly the observation posts that they have, but you can have more troops on the northern part of Idlib, kind of as a wall to prevent refugees from crossing into Turkey. And Erdogan will probably say that he's not gonna fight directly the Syrians. He cannot control all those jihadists. I mean, some of them are under his control, a lot of them are not. So there will be fighting going on in Idlib. But listen, Putin does not want this conflict in Syria to go on forever. I mean, this is not a cost-free operation for the Russians. I mean, the Russians are spending huge amounts of resources maintaining troops, doing bombing runs, and it's not as if the Syrians are paying the Russians for any bullet that is expended, because the Syrians don't have any money left. I mean, there's no economy left in Syria. Therefore, this is all being done gratis, if you want, by the Russians. And the Russian economy is not, Russia is not an economically strong power. So there is a cost to it. And I don't think Putin, looking forward, says, 4 years from now, we're still going to have Idlib under the control of the jihadists and the Syrian army, and I will be continuing to hit. No, he wants this to be over as soon as possible, which means that most of Idlib will fall into Syrian hands at some point, unless there is some kind of an international deal, which I don't see that happening. Certainly not with this president in the White House. So.
Right, but these 2 or 3 million displaced people there have to go somewhere, right?
Well, what I'm saying is what Putin and Assad have in mind is to reconquer that whole territory with the people inside. Some of them will try to leave, but a lot of them will not be able to leave, and unfortunately will be subject to Syrian retribution. But this is still Syrian nationals, and ultimately the Syrians have to rebuild. I mean, they have to rebuild this country, and they've been fighting now they've been fighting for almost 9 years, and this can't.
Henri Barkey of Lehigh University and the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.